To the UK, the British government has made a renewed pledge to allow more child refugees to come to Britain. It's one of the key parts of the agreement between France and the UK to strengthen cooperation. But the scheme to bring children to the UK under what was called the Dubs Amendment ran into problems last year. And some councils say they're already struggling to look after the number of child refugees who arrive here. Here's Emma Vardy.
Despite the dismantling of the jungle migrant camp in Calais, charities say there are still hundreds of child refugees stranded in France, making dangerous attempts to travel to the UK.
We've seen a big increase in the numbers either making their own way here, both across the Channel, but also on planes flying in to airports like Heathrow, which is in my own home borough, and those numbers who've come to the UK where they have a family connection, but it turns out that family member isn't able to look after them, and that means they pretty swiftly become the responsibility of the local council.
Refugee children with family connections in Britain have a legal right to come here. And now Theresa May has agreed with President Macron that more unaccompanied children in France will be accepted into the UK. But local councils tasked with looking after child refugees when they reach Britain say they're facing a shortfall.
The funding that's available from government in the UK is around half the cost to councils of looking after lone refugee children. And clearly, if there's going to be a very big increase for services that already are under significant pressure, then there needs to be the money to pay for the foster carers, the children's homes that are required.
Since 2016, some 200 children have been brought to the UK under the Dubs Amendment, which allowed those even without family connections to come. But the initiative stalled, with many children who were eligible seemingly left behind.
Well, the problem is the government still hasn't done what it committed to 18 months ago and what Parliament voted for with the Dubs Amendment as well. So we know there are over 200 local authority places for lone child and teenage refugees that are still empty, that have been offered but still empty because the government hasn't taken action. It may be that all of this announcement is simply the government agreeing to do what it promised to do some time ago.
The Dubs Amendment had faced significant criticism in some newspapers, with questions over the age of the children who came and the legitimacy of their claims. Despite the war in Syria being believed to be one of the key factors behind the refugee crisis, it emerged that many of the children brought to the UK came instead from African countries.
Do the public feel generous enough in these economic times to feel like we are supporting more child migrants?
There's always been a strong tradition in Britain of helping those who are fleeing persecution, right through from the kinder transport some generations ago. And I think there's also been strong support across the country in making sure we carry on doing that, particularly for those who are the most vulnerable. There do have to be proper checks in place, and it has to be effective in the system. But we've seen local authorities coming forward to offer places, but instead they've stood empty.
The British government says it also wants to provide more opportunities in people's countries of origin to try to prevent so many making the dangerous journey to France and the UK in the first place.
Well, we're joined now from Nottingham by the Conservative MP Andrew Bridgen. Welcome to the programme. Andrew, do you welcome the fact that the government has renewed its pledge to allow more unaccompanied child refugees to come to Britain?
I'm very concerned. I think we've had a very clear policy of helping refugees in the region. We've given more aid to the Syrian crisis refugees in the region than the rest of the European Union added together. And also that we use our efforts to take the most vulnerable people who can't make a journey across Europe from those camps and bring them to the UK. And I do feel that if we announce we're going to take more lone child refugees in, we are merely chucking petrol onto the fire, and we're going to have a lot more people taking the risk of that very dangerous journey, placing themselves potentially in the hands of unscrupulous people traffickers who care nothing for their welfare. And I feel we'll be doing the wrong thing for all the right reasons.
But when the Dubs Amendment was first agreed and then, in fact, was dropped, the number of 3,000 unaccompanied minors was the figure that was talked about. And Britain has only so far taken around 220. Do you really think that Britain's done its bit in taking, you talked about vulnerable people who have fled their countries? Well, surely unaccompanied children and child refugees are the most vulnerable.
And we shouldn't be encouraging them to make that journey. The most vulnerable people will be people who actually aren't well enough or too old or too vulnerable to make that long journey across Europe, and they're the people we really should be helping. And that has been the government's position. I mean, let's say it again. You know, we've put more aid into the Syrian refugee crisis in the region than any other humanitarian project in the history of our country, and we've put more money in than every country in the European Union added together.
But if there are councils who are willing to take unaccompanied children who have fled war zones like Syria, and they are already on the continent, why shouldn't Britain do its bit? It has said that it would take more.
Because we'll be exacerbating the problem, and what will happen is that more vulnerable young people will attempt to make that journey in the hope that they're going to get settled in the UK and have a new life here.
So you're against the government policy on this?
I'm for common sense and looking at human nature and doing the right thing, not only for the people of UK but also for those vulnerable refugees. And it would be doing the wrong thing for all the right reasons.
Do you accept that Britain also has to do its bit because it could be the price of Brexit and getting the sort of deal that the government would like to see, taking in more refugees and paying for the privilege of having customs officials over in France is going to be the price Britain has to pay in order to get that deal?
Well, I'm afraid that's the price we're all having to pay for Angela Merkel's very irresponsible decision a couple of years ago to basically invite the world into a borderless Europe.
It wasn't the world, it was Syrian refugees.
But most of the people who've arrived actually have come from North Africa, as your report quite accurately pointed out. These are economic migrants. Quite honestly, the bill lies with Angela Merkel, and Angela Merkel is now paying the political cost for that, in that she's actually far too toxic for anyone to want to form a coalition government within Germany.
Yes, but that wasn't the question I asked you, although I take your point about what you said on Angela Merkel. Is this the price that the British government will have to pay after the meeting between Emmanuel Macron and Theresa May, that by paying a bit of money to keep our border guards over in France and by taking more unaccompanied child refugees, we'll get a better deal?
I'm all for good bilateral relationships between us and our neighbours. We've got the Le Touquet agreement. We have to stick with that. That's not an EU agreement. That's an agreement we made with the French government. It suits both parties, and there will have to be some give and take there. But I wouldn't want to publicise the fact that by people making that very dangerous journey across Europe, place themselves in extreme danger, that they're going to enhance their opportunities of getting into the UK. So
you'd like to close the borders to unaccompanied child refugees?
I think that would be the most humanitarian thing to do for them in particular. And it's also, if you look at all the agreements, is that you claim shelter in the first safe country you get to. I mean, are we actually alleging that France is not a safe country? And the reason that France has got a migrant problem is...
Well, it's not usually the first country where those refugees have got to, France.
But France have taken the decision to join the Schengen area, and so they have no borders. All
right, let's move on to the decision by your government's Justice Secretary, David Gauke, not to seek a judicial review into the decision to release John Warboys, the black cab rapist, I should say. Do you agree with that decision?
Well, I can understand the frustration. I imagine that Mr Gauke's taken legal advice, and it's probably not correct for the government to take this action. Whether his representative of his many victims wish to do so, I think was probably a different matter. I can absolutely understand the frustration of his many victims that they'll feel that justice has not been done. He hasn't served long enough. But as I think some of your earlier contributors said, the main problem was that he was only prosecuted for 14 cases at the time, when he could have been many tens of more than that. And so the parole board have treated him, and indeed the courts have treated him, giving him a sentence that relates to the crimes to which he was prosecuted. That will not feel like justice to the tens and tens of his victims.
Right. Do you think he should have raised the idea at all, David Gauke, until he'd had that legal advice?
he may have raised expectations of the victims, but at the end of the day, if there is a judicial review, and I think the crowdfunding will deliver that for the victims, the objective can be achieved. And as Bob Neal said not long ago, there's an opportunity for other cases where there's compelling evidence that he possibly could be retried for cases which he wasn't originally indicted.
Thank you very much for joining us, Andrew Bridgen. Well, I'm joined now by the Shadow Home Secretary, Diane Abbott, who is in Central Lobby. Diane Abbott, your response to David Gauke's decision?
I haven't seen the legal advice that David Gauke has received. What I do say is I support the victims' wish to procure a judicial review. And I think it's just a shame that they're having to crowdfund to pay for it. Surely they should have support anyway. But I wouldn't want to comment on David Gauke's decision because I don't know what legal advice he received.
No, and
what we are calling for is an end-to-end review of the whole process and more transparency with parole board decision making.
Right, so you support his extension to have a look at the parole board's decisions and how they are made. But much has been made of the fact that the prosecution at the time was bungled. How much blame do you put on the prosecution service at the time for only bringing 14 cases to court, one for rape, when 102 women made allegations against John Warboys and many victims were just told, oh, he'll be inside for life, don't worry?
I think we have to look forward. We have to understand how wrong it is that the victims have to crowdfund to pursue a judicial review, and we have to have more transparency around parole board decision making.
Do you also think the police and prosecution service have to listen to victims more, because then more cases would have been brought forward and then the judge would have given a longer sentence perhaps, and the parole board would not have had the discussion to release him in under 10 years?
We don't know the detail of what happened when the decision was taken to prosecute Warboy for what was a relatively small number of offences. So it would be unwise to make statements about that. But more generally, it seems to me that the police and the prosecution authorities need more resources to enable them to take a really thorough approach to cases like these.
But isn't it that decision that has actually landed the parole board and the government in the situation it is today?
What I would say is the police and the prosecuting authorities need the resources to have a really thorough look at cases like these in the future.
Diana, but we wanted to talk to you also about child refugees and migrants. We've seen the footage of the camps in Calais, but why should Britain take in more unaccompanied minors? As Andrew Bridgen said, isn't it just fuelling the incentive for more children to make that dangerous journey?
You've seen the footage. I've actually visited the refugee camps in Calais, and I can't overstate the horror of the conditions. I know the jungle, so-called jungle, was cleared, but now hundreds more have come back in horrific conditions. And we have a moral responsibility to child refugees. And if this agreement between Macron and Theresa May means that both sides are stepping up to their responsibilities to refugees, then that's obviously a good thing.
I mean, the British Red Cross say 220 child migrants have arrived in the UK so far because of the Alf Dubs Amendment, Labour Lord. Now, the government ended that last year and set a limit of 480 children. Is that, in your mind, an arbitrary figure? Should the cap be lifted?
It's a completely arbitrary figure. The number of child refugees that we take should be determined by need, not by an arbitrary figure. There are local authorities who are willing to take these children. It's extraordinary to me that people should be arguing the toss about saving children from the awful conditions around Calais at the present time.
Right, so you think it should be whatever, I mean, there shouldn't be a limit at all. We could take thousands if that is the need.
I believe it's about need. I believe we can't have an arbitrary cap, but I also believe that both sides have to step up to their responsibilities. One of the problems on the French side has been it takes an inordinately long length of time to apply for refugee status if you're in France, and the voluntary organisations dealing with this issue believe the French themselves could do more. But no, I won't set an arbitrary limit on the number of desperate children we welcome to this country.
Just stay with us for a moment while I turn to my guests. Kate Andrews, do you think it should be, as Diane described, a case of taking in unaccompanied child refugees on a basis of need, no limit?
We have to be realistic about what we actually have the resources for. If you bring in thousands upon thousands of people and you literally can't help them because you don't have the resources, it's hard to see how that would benefit. But I do agree with Diane Abbott that the number we're taking in currently is too low. We are talking about children. We are not talking about economic migrants here. Andrew's point about being more transparent with the public about how they're being vetted and what age they are is well taken. That has to be made very, very clear. But especially post-Brexit, if Britain wants to maintain its status in the world, it needs to step up to its moral duty of helping those who are most vulnerable.
Do you think, when it came to the meeting yesterday, that Emmanuel Macron, to some extent, has the whip hand in dictating terms on things like paying for officials over in France and also Britain, in his mind, doing more to take in unaccompanied children?
I mean, the interesting thing is he actually retreated a bit from his harder position before the election campaign in France, where he wanted to rip up Le Touquet entirely. And he's taken a bit of stick in France for not getting enough from the UK, not enough money, not enough commitment on the refugee side. So I think that there's probably quite an interest on the UK side to ensure that level of engagement in taking on the UK's responsibilities is there to protect this agreement, because if the debate starts in France about why is the border in France rather than in the UK, that might be quite difficult to contain.
I mean, Diana, but do you believe that freedom of movement needs to continue even after we leave the EU? And what checks, if any, then, should there be on those coming in?
The government has agreed with our position that there has to be a transitional period when we leave the EU, and as part of that transitional period we will stay within the single market and the customs union. If we're in the single market, there will be a measure of freedom of movement. But I return to the argument that we should be taking more of these child refugees, and there can't be thousands of them because there aren't thousands of people around Calais, and I just think that's a way of ducking our moral responsibilities.
Diane Abbott, thank you very much.